Hi, hello, and welcome. It's me, Nelufar Hedayat, and you are streaming Dear World Live.
Education, I would like to argue, plays a hugely important role in leveling the playing field.
How do we actually ensure women's inclusion? How do we ensure women's safety?
Hi, hello, and indeed welcome. It's me, Nelufar Hedayat. Welcome back to another stream of Dear World Live from Doha Debates. Now, this season, we're talking about climate change in the weeks leading up to the United Nations Climate Change Conference called COP26. Today, we're talking about climate change and migration and trying to consider what actions we can take to protect climate refugees now and in the coming future. Now, in a moment, I'll be joined by my esteemed guests, Parag, Khanna, and Amali Tower. But first, what exactly do we mean when we say we're talking about climate change and migration? Well, as sea levels rise and temperatures soar and extreme weather becomes much more frequent, some places on Earth are simply going to become uninhabitable. People are forced to leave their homes and then they become environmental migrants. Now, the United Nations says this could be the situation for up to 1 billion people by 2050. But the truth is, we don't know what that number could be, and we can't even agree on how many there already are, for reasons we'll get to later in the show. Now, climate-induced migration happens everywhere because of a number of factors. Perhaps the starkest example of the threat is the low-lying islands, those in the Pacific. The Pacific island countries contribute, get this, just 0.23% of the world's greenhouse gas emissions, and yet millions of islanders risk losing their homes as sea levels rise and they're battered by extreme weather. In another case, Bangladesh, an area prone to tropical storms and flooding, it's predicted that 17% of the country will be underwater by 2050, and that means 20 million people living there will be forced to flee. That threatens not just the Bangladeshis, though. More than 870,000 Rohingya refugees living in the south of the country will also be under threat. Right, let's kick off the show by hearing from someone who has personal experience of having to move due to climate issues.
Aloha and half a day. I'm Stephen Mana'o Akamai Johnson. I'm an interdisciplinary marine scientist who studies climate change, but more importantly, I'm a Pacific Islander. I was born and raised on Saipan, an island in Micronesia, and my home, like many islands across the world, are amongst the most vulnerable to climate change, despite contributing very little to the problem. Climate change has already taken a toll on the social and environmental systems of these islands, causing many people to migrate. Some places around the world have been identified as climate refugia, areas that are expected to have fewer or mild climate impacts. I happen to be living in one of those areas for the past 4 years, the American Pacific Northwest. This region is known for its relatively cool and mild temperatures and abundant freshwater resources. But in June 2021, it was one of the hottest places on the planet. A heat dome sat over the region, raising temperatures to record highs. And since most of the infrastructure in the region isn't built for such extreme heat, my household, along with hundreds, if not thousands of other households, had to move out to the coastal regions to escape the heat. And even though this displacement was only for a day, it hammered home a key point. Climate change is a problem with global consequences, and that means there's no escaping it. One thing is very certain, though. Climate change is making the things we used to be very confident about, like the temperature of a given region, a lot more variable and less stable. I've had the misfortune of experiencing climate change on both the front lines in my home in Saipan and from an area thought to be a refuge, the Pacific Northwest. If we don't cooperate and collaborate to solve this great challenge, there's a good chance that many more of us will have to move, And unfortunately, it won't be for just today.
That was Stephen Mana'o Akamai Johnson from the island of Saipan in the Pacific, giving us just a glimpse of what life could be like for many millions of us in the future. Right. Remember, this show is all about you. What are your views, your perspectives? Have you ever even heard of a climate refugee? What do you think about it? Should we let all of them in? Should we be counting numbers? How should we be assessing the situation going forward? And more importantly, what should we want and expect from our thought leaders and politicians to be doing? Drop us your questions and your comments into the chat function of wherever you are streaming Dear World Live. We are Doha Debates across all of our social media platforms. Join us, like our stuff, share, and watch. Okay, without any further ado, it's time to kick off the show. Let's meet today's guests. Parag Khanna is a leading global strategy advisor and best-selling author of, count them, 8 books and co-author of 2 more. His latest, Move the Forces Uprooting Us, puts forward practical ideas on how to build a sustainable future and survive climate change. Amali Tower is a founder and executive director of Climate Refugees, which works to promote the rights and protections of people displaced by climate change. She's worked for the UN Refugee Agency and the US Refugee Admissions Program and has written and worked on US legislation to curb migration detention. And I hope on a stable connection with me from the Philippines is our wonderful student and audience member. This week it's Carmela Francesca Adelantar, and she is a climate activist and a good governance advocate studying political science at the University of the Philippines, Visayas. Thank you all for joining us today. Amali, if I may come to you first, you are the founder and executive director of Climate Refugees. Can you tell us a little bit about your organization and why you even felt the need to start it? What was that need you were serving?
Yeah, well, thank you so much for having me on your show, Nelufar. Yes, as you said, I come from a background in refugee protection. That means, I was working with people who are displaced by conflict, by violence, by persecution, those who can find protection under the 1951 Refugee Convention. And it was in this context that I actually heard directly from refugees. For example, speaking to Somalis in the Horn of Africa, who, when asked a question, when asked, when interviewing them for consideration for resettlement to the United States, a typical question one would ask is, why can't you return to your country of origin? And to hear people speak then about drought, livelihood loss, successive years of crop failure, and that there's nothing to return to because of conditions that are basically climate change and environmental degradation is astounding. When you know that there's a conflict at home, right? That there's very much a militant group like Al-Shabaab that controls, that there's intra-clan violence, that there are gross human rights violations. It took me years, Nelufar, to really unpack the power of that.
Wow.
But when I did, what I did recognize is that, what climate change does is disproportionately impacts the world's poorest, and it violates human rights for the people who are on the front lines of this crisis.
I'm actually glad you're telling me that it took you some time to figure that out, because I feel really stupid. And I don't know if anyone watching else does, because I thought climate refugees, that doesn't make any sense. What could that mean? I find it really hard to put the idea of climate change and human displacement in the same parts of my brain. And when you spoke about it like that, it made me realize that that's because the things we're talking about are so big, so difficult to track. They don't happen in a lifespan. They don't happen in a single moment. You have to watch for these things. And so I've got another question for you. Your organization is named Climate Refugees. Is there a specific reason that you called it that?
Well, yeah, I mean, building on exactly what I was just saying, right? I mean, the fact is that while the Refugee Convention did not envision, right, that climate change as a perceived threat to human security, but in fact, climate change is akin to persecution for much of the global population dependent on the land, on natural resources for livelihood, much like I just explained to you in the Somali example. Add to that, climate change is now disproportionately impacting countries who are, like I said, on the front lines of this. So much so that today, climate change is increasingly contributing to driving displacement, where 90% of today's refugees come from countries that are most vulnerable and least ready to adapt to climate change. So even though most climate displacement is internal, that means within the borders of one's own country, I would say that by no means diminishes the protection needs of displaced populations and the assistance that climate vulnerable countries will need from the international community. And add to this, of course, we live in times when the world is increasingly hostile to refugees, migrants, and asylum seekers, and the human rights protections afforded to displaced persons in general.
Absolutely.
So it's really about, sorry, just to say that it's really about drawing political attention then to the fact that, you know, just because it's not a ground that's protected, that just by no means diminishes those human rights conditions and the lack of protections. That,
and what I'm hearing from you is that laws and regulations and the fact that we don't have the language to serve the needs of these people is not a good enough excuse for inaction. And that's why I want to come to Parag. You've written an entire book. Well, you've written many books, but this particular one focuses specifically on how the world is going to have to adapt to this brand new reality, Parag. Why is migration and climate change such an important topic to discuss right now?
Well, thank you so much, Nelufar. Great to see you again. And I do want to echo what Amali has said. She's absolutely right. For some historical context, by the way, when we think about migration and refugees, our experience, of course, is the 18th, 19th, and 20th centuries. And in those centuries, economic migration, people fleeing hardship and deprivation, but also, of course, wars, conflicts, genocides, that dominates our mentality, our understanding of who migrants and refugees are. But in the 21st century, climate migrants, climate displaced people, and climate refugees will massively outnumber economic and political migrants. And that's already true today in the sense that even within the category of people who are considered refugees, the number who are climate refugees is equal or greater than the other categories. So this is a reality of today. And of course, the climate factor plays a role in what we consider to be political violence and displacement situations like Syria, like Darfur, like Yemen, and so on. So we absolutely we should appreciate the category of climate migration as something new and something absolutely massive. But we also have to not separate these buckets neatly and appreciate that in some ways all migration or refugee situations have some climate factor involved in them. It's not something that we're going to be able to simply solve.
And you've done so much work on this, and I want to bring up a couple of slides now of things that you've been working on specifically. Talk me through what we're seeing here.
So this is a neat and orderly map. It shows you what the regional patterns and clusters of migration have been that we've settled into over the last 30 years since the end of the Cold War, which is to say that most migration has been regional and the stock and flow of people has remained broadly within these regional zones. For example, there's more African migration within Africa, Latin Americans to North America, Europeans within Europe, people from the former Soviet republics within that former Soviet zone, Asians within Asia, South Asians, of course, to the Gulf. But tell me, when you look at that image, right, where is climate change in that? It's not. And it will not hold that people will simply move because of economic migration. My work is needed here across the border, I'll go, and that will sort of be managed in a legal, sensible, orderly way.
So what happens when we factor in climate change? What happens when we do that? What does that look like?
Right, and so bring up that next map, and I'll show you. If you look at this, right, this is what the IPCC, NASA, other authorities are telling us when they map the change in what's called the suitability niche, right? The latitudes that most human beings inhabit today are now red on this map. As we move towards the years 2030, 2040, again, I don't like to set distant dates because then people think that it's not a problem until then. But this is happening right now. Look at the geographies of drought. rivers drying up, desertification, and so forth. People are being pushed out. And according to these expert reports, for every 1 degree of temperature rise, about 1 billion people are getting displaced from their natural geography of habitation. And we're already at that 1 degree mark, aren't we?
What's interesting to see in that image, as I was scanning across that band of red, that band of inhabitability, is that there are bits of America in there as well, North America, specifically the United States. There are bits of sort of Europe that land on that, and across Africa and into Asia. So this isn't going to be something that affects no one group of people will be exempt from it, but I feel like the burden, as Amali talked to so passionately then, is going to fall on a certain group of people. And we will get to the idea of data and data analysis and data collection and trying to figure out how that affects policy in a moment. But for now, I want to thank all of those of you who are streaming Dear World Live right now. My name is Nelufar Hedayat. Welcome to this episode of Dear World Live. We are talking about climate change and migration. And so far, I can see folks tuning in from Washington, D.C., from Doha, from Johannesburg, from Honduras, Ethiopia, Sudan. You are welcome. Tell me what you think about the conversation so far. A lot of what you've heard from my two guests is quite difficult to process. So do you have any questions? Is there anything that you want to ask them? Write them in the comment section of wherever you're streaming the show, and I will put you in the show. Why not? Remember also that we are at Doha Debates across all of our social channels. Now, let me turn our attention to our student audience member. And this week, we're joined by Carmela Francesca Adelanto. Thank you for joining. So what have you made of what Parag and Amali have said so far? How does that make you feel?
So far with other speakers have told earlier, the climate anxiety is really real for us here in the Philippines. I was talking to other people from Doha Debates by 2 typhoons straight for just a week. And most of the people from the northern part of the Philippines were, there were a lot of casualties. There were a lot of students that was interrupted from their school, from their online classes. Then some of the young people were anxious about whether or not they wake up being drowned by flood, or whether or not they will wake up alive, still alive. Because presented earlier, and according to the IPCC report, the Philippines, with carbon emission and the rising temperature of the planet, suffers more compared to other countries, so contributes more to carbon emission. And that is injustice. And that impacts young people, even indigenous peoples here in the Philippines, that are forced to go outside the country and to look for better life in other countries and seek for refuge. One of that manifestation was during Typhoon Haiyan, that impacted the Philippines. That is the strongest typhoon that impacted the planet. And there were a lot of casualties. There were a lot of children lost home. And what would be the future awaits for us if this continue? And some of the parents already are telling their kids to seek better life outside the Philippines. Some of the parents are already seeking jobs outside the Philippines, wherein the Philippines has really rich in natural resources. We have a lot to offer. But if climate change and if climate crisis continues, the Philippines will wipe out from the map, and the Filipinos will be forced to seek refuge from other countries, and this really scares us.
Now, just to capture, because what you said is so impactful and so important, and you are living and breathing the reality of climate change every day. I want to make sure that we've captured your point succinctly, Carmela. You spoke about the fact that you live in the Philippines, that you live and breathe these issues every day, that there are moments in the lives of the people that you share a classroom with, that you go to school with, where they're not sure if they're going to survive the next typhoon. And these extreme weathers are becoming more and more regular, is what I'm hearing you say. And then I think there was a question for our two guests that I want to get to now. You wanted to know, how will the issue of climate migration impact the upcoming sort of big decisions, especially at COP26? Is that right?
Yes.
Is that the question that you have? It's just the connection is quite poor. So Perfect. So
Yes.
I want to put that first to Amali. Amali, what do you think of this question coming from Carmela?
That's a great question, Carmela, and a fair one, and speaks to the injustice that is, quite frankly, missing as part of the agenda, and needs to be at the heart of the issues that policymakers should be discussing in Glasgow in a few weeks. Quite frankly, it's underrepresented. It's almost missing from the conversation. What you will see in terms of climate migration and displacement, and where this topic is being discussed, it's in side events. It's through civil society. It's through grassroots organizations, and that is where the bulk of the work is being done. And much of that is actually people who are already impacted by that. Even civil society actors are people, just like what Carmela is talking about. It will not be surprising at all to see activists who are also victims of the climate crisis. What I like to say is, in short, Nelufar, we're dealing with a situation where people who have already been living in extreme poverty are now dealing with extreme weather.
I mean, it's a compounding issue that seems to be coming to a head. Carmela made some really stark points, Parag, about the fact that her colleagues, her schoolmates don't know what's going to come at the next typhoon. When you were researching your book and when you were specifically thinking about this, do you find that the voices of the everyday people who are living this reality are being drowned out by policy talk or think tank speech? And how does that make you feel?
It's maddening, actually, Nelufar, and I want to echo Amali here, because all attention is focused on COP26. And I couldn't agree more that on the one hand, of course, we have to invest even more efforts and Manhattan projects in decarbonization of industries and greening supply chains as much as possible, transitioning towards renewable energy. All of that fits into the category of climate mitigation. How do we reduce the current volume of greenhouse gas emissions and temperature rise? And of course, we must focus energy on that. But climate adaptation, which is something that we have to focus on right now, every single day, for hundreds of millions of people, is not on that agenda. It is not on the COP26 agenda. It's not going to be discussed in Glasgow. And it's fine. It's not their mandate, so to speak. But we also have to remember that when sovereign governments get together, the one thing that they will not agree to anyway is some kind of a global migration agreement or accord or compact or law. That's not going to happen. It will.
Why won't they do that? I mean, isn't that the? I mean, it's exasperating. It's what COP26 is supposed to be. Carmela agrees with me. I can see her nodding there. This is what we place our trust in our politicians for. But I feel like, Parag and Amali, that you've been around this block before. You know this trick. You know this game and how it plays out. And I want to maybe have you two talk to each other about some of the frustrations that you face as thinkers and actors in this space. Maybe if we can have a two-shot of the two of you talking to each other, it would be nice.
Well, Amali, can I ask you, do you see evidence beyond the bilateral level of cooperation around climate refugees? You've got climate visas for the Pacific Islanders that New Zealand has granted. I could imagine that one day, eventually, the people of the Maldives will be offered some kind of, safe haven or transit towards residency in a country like India. But tell me where you see a regional or global, if there is any, agreement on what to do with climate displaced people, because I don't see it, and I definitely don't see it on the COP agenda.
Mm-hmm. You're absolutely right. There aren't any sort of regional agreements at this level. What I will say is that there are some very positive developments in terms of like free protocol agreements, ECOWAS, which is West African states. This is a good trend, a good protocol, a very good agreement, and sort of a pathway forward. What it says is that the goods and movement of people within a body of West African states is fine, is legitimate. Now, this is exactly what global cooperation should look like, what regional cooperation should look like. It holds sacred and the understanding of a shared experience. And I think that the reason you're seeing that come about from ECOWAS and from countries that are on the front lines of this is because there's understanding. They are actually going through it. The continent of Africa, 54 states, have contributed to global emissions somewhere in the ballpark of 2 to 4%. And yet the Sahel is warming at a rate that's 1.5% faster than anywhere else in the world. We know what the Sahel is going through in terms of conflict, in terms of environmental degradation, in terms of drought, in terms of displacement. And these are not the issues being discussed. Instead, we're asking Africa to mitigate its emissions. And to Parag's point, it should be about adaptation, right? So what can I say? What's positive about this? What are we working on as activists? We are trying to push forward policies that are rooted in justice. And that is to ask for the international community, for the rich polluting countries, and I will also include the corporations that are complicit in this, to pay the polluter pay principle of loss and damage, which is in Article 8 of the Paris Agreement, which is language that has been accepted and adopted by sovereign states that has gone absolutely nowhere, to say it is time to pay for compensation for the irreparable losses and damage that these countries are suffering. And this is what will happen at COP26.
Let's see what Carmela makes of this. I want to see if I can bring you in, Carmela, and see if our connection is good enough. Should rich polluting nations like the one I'm in right now, the United Kingdom, or the one Parag and Amali are now, should we be paying the Philippines some sort of compensation for what we have done to this planet? Do you support that? What do you think of it?
Yes, I really do support that policy or calls for rich nations who have been contributing greatly to climate crisis, because once and for all, they have greatly impacted developing countries without any sort of accountability at all. And it's time, it's more than ever, that we pressure these governments, these rich states, to pay for the loss and damage to these to developing countries like the Philippines, because humanitarian efforts, or like the help that they are giving every time the Philippines experience disasters, is not enough. It's not enough to sustain the lives of the people. It is not the humanitarian efforts that these countries are giving will not going to suffice the lives that the climate crisis had cost.
So I want to stop there in that moment. I feel like we're all coming to a consensus that the fact that price has to be paid. I want to go to the folks who are watching Dear World Live being streamed right now. Thank you for watching. Wherever in the world you are, you have mere moments to send in your comments. Any questions for my guests on the show today? What do you think about the issue of this episode in this stream of Dear World Live on climate change and migration? Send me your thoughts and comments. Write them in the chat function wherever you're streaming the show. We have had some questions come in from Georgetown University in Qatar, and this is from Sarah Ahmed. Sarah says, not only do we need policies that protect current climate change migrants, we need a strong, comprehensive system in place that fully recognizes and takes into consideration the future of our planet. Marwan Ali from Texas A&M says governments should work seriously on involving the youth, especially those in communities affected by climate change. So echoing what's been said on the show already. And the final one from Ashish Khan at Georgetown. I hope I've said that right, Ashish. At Georgetown University in Qatar says, as a political student, the first thing I can think about is the role of climate change in contemporary policy decisions and how it's impacting political relations between nation states, which is something that Parag is mentioned before. Remember, we are Doha Debates across all our social media platforms. You've got moments to get in any big questions that you have. But for now, I want to go back to all of my guests. Put them all up. Let's have a look at all of them. There they are. We've had a robust conversation about the little that's been done. And in fact, I'm going to be at COP26 in 2 weeks. And if I find a politician, I'm going to grab them by the collar and tell them exactly what the three of you have been saying. Now, in this season, we're trying to amplify climate voices just like yours from people all around the world and get their message to our global leaders who will be at the COP26 climate conference, as we will be Doha Debates in November. So speaking directly to our audience now, what's one thing, my dear guests, that people at home can do to make our leaders listen and take action? Amali, I'll come to you first. Parag, you're next.
I would say that in any issue that you're working on, in any social justice cause, recognize that there is a climate component to it. Because we like to say that climate change affects us all, but I really think that we need to say climate change affects us all, but not equally. We never started at the same starting point. That is why you're seeing disproportionate impacts. That is why no country in the world is unaffected. But it's important to recognize that it's the world's poorest, the most vulnerable, and oppressed people who are already paying disproportionate prices. So it's really important to recognize that this is a justice issue. And that's the point at which you have to advocate for change. And that's the point at which you have to ask for policymakers for rooted policy changes that get to the heart of the matter and the injustice of that all. Because, we can have laws and we can even like enact protocols, but it's the enforcement that's always an issue. So, you've got to get to the root of issues and recognize that this crosses many different sectors within society.
Parag, I want to come to you next. What advice would you give our audience?
You must advocate for migration as a fundamental right, perhaps one of the paramount rights of the 21st century. And that is not just a airy-fairy talk, because if you think about the difference between how governments deal with political migrants versus climate migrants, it's very different. Right now, as we speak, and Nelufar, I know this is very important to you as well, political refugees from Syria are actually being sent back, because the host country has a right to repatriate people if they deem that a country is stable enough for them to return. Now apply that logic to a climate refugee, someone who's come from a country that is no longer habitable. You cannot, in good conscience, send them back. So we need a permanent solution, which migration is a fundamental right, and the right to relocation to a stable habitat is something that we have not yet codified, and we absolutely must.
I love both of those. Thank you. We'll be posting some of the information both of our guests have mentioned in the comments section where we are streaming to you. So keep an eye out there and get involved. Before I come to you, Carmela, I just want to read a couple of comments that have come across to us across our social media. Marta Amarel is on Twitter and says, local solutions and good governments are the answer, not global solutions. And then we've got one in from Sekoy Smiley, who says, hello, do you think relevant decisions about climate change can be made while capitalism is still the primary economic system? I think continued growth in production is this. Wonderful questions. I think we've actually come to a few of those during the course of this show. So thank you to both of those comments. We are running out of time on this particular stream. Carmela, I want to come to you after that conversation and those bits of advice from our guests. What do you make of that? Any of those that you're going to take with you in your daily life?
As a climate activist and as a policy lobbyist and a researcher as well, there were a lot of good comments coming from the guests that we would really want to consider here in the Philippines, because we see COP26 as a do or die game. We have to put all our hands on deck to really ask the governments to act on climate change purposefully, compassionately, and genuinely. This is something that really matters to the Philippines, and I am glad to hear those kinds of words from the guest itself. Thank you very much for having me.
That is all the time we have on the show. Thank you very much, my guests. Say goodbye, wave goodbye, Parag Khanna, Amali Towers, and Carmela Francesca Adelanta. Thank you for being on the show. Well, that's the end of today's stream of Dear World Life, but don't you dare go anywhere, because throughout this entire month leading up to the COP26 climate conference, we at Doha Debates are celebrating. What are we celebrating? Well, 26 young change makers that we're calling Solving It 26. We're honoring young people for their work, organizing climate strikes, advocating for policy change, and educating their communities, and developing solutions to tackle the climate crisis. Go check out these climate champions at solvingit26.com right now. If you're not moved by the amazing artwork that we've curated, then you will be by their stories and what they're doing. And there's great insight into what you can do if this is getting your goat. I'll be back next week for an episode about climate change and Indigenous ways of thinking. Please join us all then. That's all from us at Dear World Live. Bye.